This morning, he's given us a video to watch. It's about the lost book of Abraham. And it's a remarkable claim that the Mormons make, and it's an investigation of that claim. And so there are several different things that we will see, and we've been seeing in his class, about claims that they make and how those claims are unsubstantiated, which gives us then pause. If you are a true student and want to know truth, it gives you pause when you find no evidence to back up a claim. And the problem in Mormonism is a lot of the times those that are in Mormonism really don't care about doctrine. That's not why they're there. They're in Mormonism because of the social aspects of it. And doctrine does not really matter to them. But if they're young people, those young people really have some questions that they have. And that's a good time for investigation. If they're thinkers, they want to know if this is real or not. That's when you can oftentimes see a transition in their lives. Some of them come out and get saved, especially after a mission. If they've dealt with some good issues and some good people that have been able to talk to them. I've talked with several that have gotten saved after a mission. And it took a while, but they investigated the truth afterwards because they became inquisitive. And so it's good for us to have some of these things in mind. And this is a video that we're going to look at today in Mike's absence.
This is the Book of Abraham, a part of the scriptures used today by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons. But where did this book come from? Joseph Smith, founder of the Mormon Church, claimed to translate it from an ancient Egyptian scroll he purchased from a traveling antiquities dealer in 1835. Smith claimed the scroll contained a lost book of Abraham, an original text nearly 4,000 years old. At the time in America, no one could read ancient Egyptian, but today, Egyptologists know exactly what it says. So what was this ancient scroll? Was it the lost book of Abraham, or was it something else? Stay tuned and find out for yourself. Imagine yourself here in Kirtland, Ohio in 1835. You're in the Western Reserve. The people are farmers, blacksmiths, and millers, and about 25% are part of a fledgling community known as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons. Joseph Smith and his followers came to Kirtland in early 1831. And though the people are poor, they've begun construction on an elaborate new temple. Joseph was a young man, but he was able to inspire people, generate enthusiasm, and raise money. The temple was expensive and took a great sacrifice on the part of the people to build. But now Joseph needs to raise some more money. And what he wants to buy may surprise you. A traveling antiquities dealer named Michael H. Chandler has come to town peddling his wares, an exhibit of all things, 4 Egyptian mummies. It was a spectacle. For a small price, you could see fragments of mysterious writings, things from ancient Egypt, even real mummified human corpses, all of which had been unearthed since Bible times. Chandler and his exhibit were always able to draw a crowd. The four mummies were the main drawing card, but several prominent Brethren of the Mormon Church became even more intrigued by the scrolls with mysterious ancient writing, Egyptian writing. 5 years earlier, Joseph Smith, their prophet and leader, had published the Book of Mormon, a remarkable work in that Joseph said he had not actually authored the book, but rather he had translated it from the records of an ancient pre-Columbian civilization. Joseph said an angel appeared to him, an angel named Moroni, who presented Joseph with a set of gold plates. The plates were said to have been inscribed with a mysterious language called Reformed Egyptian. The story is that Joseph Smith translated the gold plates by the gift and power of God. But Joseph said he was required to return the plates to the angel after completing his translation, so they are not available for independent examination. When the Book of Mormon was published in 1830, it established Joseph Smith as a prophet and seer in the eyes of his followers. Joseph had brought forth one volume of lost scripture, and they believed God would use him to restore other lost scriptures.
One of the original appeals, I think, of early Mormonism was Joseph Smith's claim to be a prophet, seer, and revelator. He had promised that the Lord was opening up the bowels of the earth and bringing forth ancient scriptures, and would continue to do so because we were living in the last days of the earth.
When Michael Chandler arrived in Kirtland with ancient papyrus scrolls covered with mysterious, unknown writings, the saints wondered if their prophet could decipher these records.
What happened was the enthusiasm was there for the members of the church to think that these things had tremendous value, that the Lord indeed was bringing to the prophet Joseph Smith these documents for him to translate.
Joseph said that he could indeed decipher these scrolls. In fact, he said these were more than just ancient Egyptian artifacts. These were none other than the writings of Abraham and Joseph, famous figures from the Old Testament of the Bible. If this were true, these scrolls would be an unprecedented and momentous discovery, a preservation of writings from 2,000 years before Christ. But what were they really? Stay tuned as we investigate a remarkable Mormon claim, the rediscovery of a lost book of Abraham. The story begins in 1833 in the eastern United States, when a man named Michael Chandler was commissioned to sell a collection of ancient Egyptian antiquities. The collection included 11 mummies, 2 papyrus scrolls, and several scroll fragments. The artifacts had originally been exhumed by a tomb raider named Antonio Lobolo in the early 1820s from a burial site along the banks of the Nile River near the Egyptian city of Thebes. After Lobolo's death, his estate shipped the artifacts to New York City, hoping they could be sold for a profit. Chandler's travels with the antiquities included stops in Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Harrisburg, where he was able to sell 7 of the mummies. He arrived in Cleveland in March of 1835 with the papyrus scrolls and 4 remaining mummies. An article in the Cleveland Advertiser newspaper of March 26, 1835, noted Chandler's interest in selling his remaining artifacts.
The exhibitor permits as free an examination of them as is consistent with their preservation. Specimens of the ancient method of writing on papyrus found with the mummies are also shown by Mr. Chandler, whose intelligent conversation adds much to the interest of the exhibition. The collection is offered for sale by the proprietor. Cleveland Advertiser, March 26, 1835.
Michael Chandler was apparently acting as an agent for several businessmen in Philadelphia. And apparently the arrangement was that he was supposed to display and sell these antiquities as he displayed them and keep a small commission for himself and send the remainder of the money back to the businessmen in Philadelphia. Once he was out on the road, he apparently lost contact with his businessmen and was dispensing of these antiquities as he went and keeping the entire profit for himself. He had heard about Joseph Smith, the Mormon prophet, and his abilities to translate languages, and so he wended his way to Kirtland, Ohio, and arrived there in July of 1835.
Chandler's arrival in Kirtland was described at the time by William W. Phelps, a member of the Mormon community, in a letter to his wife.
4 Egyptian mummies were brought here. There were 2 papyrus rolls besides some other ancient Egyptian writings with them. As no one could translate these writings, they were presented to President Smith. He soon knew what they were and said they, the rolls of papyrus, contained the sacred record of Joseph in Pharaoh's court in Egypt and the teachings of Father Abraham. God has so ordered it that these mummies and writings have been brought into the church. July 20, 1835.
That created a tremendous value for these papyri. But Chandler was unwilling to sell the papyri by themselves. That was all that the prophet was interested in. He insisted on selling the 4 mummies that were all that were left now, and everything. He was ready now to unload the entire collection of antiquities that he had left.
Remember, this is a movement that is sort of the religion of the book squared, because not only is it the religion of the book in the Old and New Testament, but the Book of Mormon as well. So there has to be a real concern about texts. Text. And so text would appear, even to the ordinary citizen of Kirtland, I would think, as much more critical than the mummies.
His selling price was $2,400, which was an extreme sum in those days. Smith didn't have it, but since these were such valuable documents, Smith used 2 other people to invest sums of money, and they did, and Chandler sold these antiquities to Joseph Smith, and that's how he came into possession of them.
Joseph Smith said that to properly translate these scrolls would take some time, but that a few of the Egyptian characters were recognizable to him immediately, and he translated these for Chandler. Chandler thanked him profusely and supplied an affidavit endorsing Smith's scholarship.
This is to make known to all who may be desirous concerning the knowledge of Mr. Joseph Smith in deciphering the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic characters in my possession, which I have in many eminent cities showed to the most learned. And from the information that I could ever learn or meet with, I find that of Mr. Joseph Smith to correspond in the most minute matters.
Translation of the papyri commenced almost at once, with Joseph focusing his attention on one of the papyrus scrolls, which he identified as an ancient record of Abraham.
I have commenced the translation of some of the characters, or hieroglyphics, and much to our joy have found that one of the rolls contained the writings of Abraham, another with the writings of Joseph of Egypt, a more full account of which will appear in its place, as I proceed to examine or unfold them. Truly we can say, the Lord is beginning to reveal the abundance of peace and truth. July 5, 1835.
It was a remarkable claim. Could these papyri actually be the writings of Abraham, the patriarchal father of the Jewish, Christian, and Islamic religions? Did Joseph Smith really have the ability or inspiration to translate ancient Egyptian? And could these scrolls be what Joseph Smith claimed they were? In the weeks immediately after purchasing the scrolls, Joseph threw himself enthusiastically into the task of translation. He records in his diary that he began by developing an alphabet and grammar of the Egyptian language. The townspeople were duly impressed with the work, and scores of visitors would call on the prophet to see for themselves these wondrous things.
I was continually engaged in translating an alphabet of the Book of Abraham and arranging a grammar of the Egyptian language as practiced by the ancients. July 1835. In the afternoon, I waited on most of the 12 apostles in my house and exhibited to them the ancient records and gave explanations. This day passed off with the blessing of the Lord. October 3, 1835.
In 1835 in America, there was no one who could read ancient Egyptian. All knowledge of the language had been lost for centuries. Only recently had the French scholar Jean-Francois Champollion made a breakthrough in deciphering the ancient Egyptian language. The Rosetta Stone, a trilingual inscription in Greek, Egyptian hieroglyphic, and Demotic, was the key which allowed Champollion to unlock ancient Egyptian. But his work was far away from the pioneers of rural Ohio.
In the 1840s in the United States, the ancient Egyptian language was virtually unknown. It had only been deciphered beginning in 1822, and that knowledge simply had not crossed the Atlantic, so that almost any interpretation given to an Egyptian document in 1842 or 45 or 50 or even 1860 would have been believable to a general audience who would have no way of comparing it with the actual truth.
But in his diary, Joseph Smith confidently records doing what no scholar in America in his day could do: translating ancient Egyptian scrolls.
This afternoon, I labored on the Egyptian alphabet in company with brothers Oliver Cowdery and W. Phelps. And during the research, the principles of astronomy, as understood by Father Abraham and the ancients, unfolded to our understanding, the particulars of which will appear hereafter. October 1, 1835. This afternoon, I recommenced translating from the ancient records. October 7, 1835. I returned home and spent the day in translating the Egyptian records. A warm and pleasant day. November 19, 1835. Spent the forenoon instructing those that called to inquire concerning the things of God in the last days. And in the afternoon, we translated some of the Egyptian records. November 24, 1835. Spent the day translating. November 25, 1835. At home, we spent the day in transcribing Egyptian characters from the papyrus. I'm severely afflicted with a cold. November 26, 1835.
Joseph Smith, in his diary of July 1835, talked specifically about translating characters or hieroglyphics and finding that it was about, one was about Abraham and one was about Joseph. So there was a book of Abraham and there was a book of Joseph.
He, with a couple of his scribes, began working on an alphabet and grammar of the Egyptian language. And we have documents, some of which, or one of which, was written by Joseph Smith himself, with some additions by Oliver Cowdery, and another one in the handwriting of William W. Phelps. And then we have, in addition, some remarks made, or small additions made, in the handwriting of Warren Parrish.
Through the autumn and early winter of 1835, Joseph continued to work on the project, and eventually the mummies and the scrolls were moved to an upper floor room here at the Kirtland Temple, where Joseph continued to work on the translation. But the translation project soon tapered off, and Joseph moved on to other matters related to leading his community. He established his own bank in Kirtland and issued his own currency. But in 1838, when the venture went bankrupt, Joseph fled Kirtland on horseback in the middle of the night and never returned. In 1839, the Mormon community relocated to a small town on the banks of the Mississippi River known as Commerce, Illinois. Joseph renamed the town Nauvoo, a Hebrew word meaning beautiful.
I mean, it was a place with a few houses and 2 stores, I think. It was just a little tiny wide spot in the road, but it was located on a really pretty bluff. There were, maybe 20 people there, 25, 30, and it became the largest town in Illinois within 5 years.
In Nauvoo, Joseph would achieve his greatest fame. He was the mayor of the town and had his own militia of nearly 3,000 men. At the time, the U.S. military totaled less than 9,000. And there was even a movement underway to nominate Joseph for the presidency of the United States. It was in Nauvoo that Joseph finally published his translation of the Abraham Scroll, It first appeared in 1842 in 3 installments of a Mormon newspaper called The Times and Seasons. It was called the Book of Abraham, and a note at the beginning introduced it as a translation of some ancient records that have fallen into our hands from the catacombs of Egypt, purporting to be the writings of Abraham while he was in Egypt, called the Book of Abraham, written by his own hand upon papyrus. Today, the Book of Abraham is included in a volume of Mormon scripture called the Pearl of Great Price. It is considered inspired scripture by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, of equal authority to the Bible. The Book of Abraham includes a creation story, but it's dramatically different than the biblical creation story found in the book of Genesis. Where the Bible points to one true creator God, the Book of Abraham recounts a startling new twist.
And then the Lord said, "Let us go down." And they went down at the beginning, and they, that is the gods, organized and formed the heavens and the earth. Book of Abraham, chapter 4, verse 1. And the gods said among themselves, "On the 7th time we will end our work, which we have counseled, and we will rest on the 7th time from all our work which we have counseled." And the gods concluded upon the 7th time, because that on the 7th time they would rest from all their works, which they, the gods, counseled among themselves to form, and sanctified it. And thus were their decisions at the time that they counseled among themselves to form the heavens and the earth. Book of Abraham, chapter 5, verses 2 and 3.
Judaism and Christianity have always been monotheistic religions. There's one God. There's one creator. And if he had a council, it was a council of created angelic beings that did his bidding by his sovereign authority. And the idea of equally co-eternal beings working with him on a group project is totally unprecedented in Jewish and Christian teaching.
Joseph Smith announced that he would publish additional installments of his Book of Abraham, but he never did. And in June of 1844, he was assassinated.
And a group of Mormon dissidents published a newspaper called the Nauvoo Expositor, which accused Joseph Smith as mayor of taking too much into his own hands. And there were some references in the Nauvoo Expositor to the notion of plural marriage. And so, as mayor, he sent the constabulary to destroy the newspaper. And the governor brought him into Carthage, Illinois, and put him in jail. And then the governor turned his back and took the militia and went to Nauvoo, leaving the jail unprotected. And then other militia with blackened faces came in and shot him.
On June 27th, 1844, his cell was stormed. Joseph was shot, and as he fell from a second-floor window, he was fired upon numerous times. No one was ever convicted for his brutal murder. In 1846, under the leadership of Brigham Young, the Mormons made their historic trek from Nauvoo to the Great Salt Lake Valley. At the time, this was isolated frontier territory, far from the jurisdiction of the U.S. government. And though Joseph Smith was no longer leading the Mormons, his Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, and Pearl of Great Price, including the Book of Abraham, all became canon, inspired scriptures on par with the Old and New Testaments of the Bible. They are the basis for the unique theology of the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints to this day. In the Great Salt Lake Valley, the Mormons once again proved their ability to settle frontier territory and to build a thriving town. They began work on another temple, their greatest yet. But the scroll Joseph Smith had identified as a lost Book of Abraham remained in Illinois, in the possession of Joseph's mother, Lucy Mack Smith, and his widow, Emma. In 1856, 12 days after Lucy's death, Emma Smith, who now seemed to have ambivalent feelings about her late husband, sold the papyri to a man named Abel Combs. Emma, now remarried to a man named Louis C. Bideman, provided an affidavit attesting that the antiquities
had belonged to Joseph.
This certifies that we have sold to Mr. A. Combs 4 Egyptian mummies with the records of them. They were purchased by the Mormon prophet Joseph Smith at the price of $2,400 in the year 1835. They were highly prized by Mr. Smith on account of the importance which attached to the record, which was accidentally found enclosed in the breast of one of the mummies. Emma Smith Bideman, May 26, 1856.
One of the things that is really interesting about Emma Smith, she was very much engaged in the process of forgetting as well as remembering, because she has to forget that he introduced plural marriage into Mormonism. Even though we know that she was at some of these ceremonies where he married other women that were friends of hers, and her husband married them as well. She told her sons that it was Brigham Young that introduced plural marriage into Mormonism.
2 of the mummies sold to Abel Combs were later acquired by a Chicago museum that was destroyed in the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. It was assumed that the Joseph Smith papyri had also been destroyed, lost forever to the emerging knowledge of Egyptology.
From early on, non-Mormons were dubious of Joseph's claim to have recovered a book written by Abraham 2,000 years before Christ and lost for nearly 4,000 years.
A man named William West, who visited the Mormons in Kirtland and viewed Joseph Smith's Egyptian scrolls, expressed his doubts in an 1837 pamphlet.
Is it possible that a record written by Abraham containing the most important revelations that God ever gave to man should be entirely lost by the tenacious Israelites and preserved by the unbelieving Egyptians, and by them embalmed and deposited in the catacombs with an Egyptian priest? I venture to say no. It is not possible. It is more likely that the records are Egyptian.
In 1859, a French Egyptologist named Théodule de Verrier provided the first scholarly evaluation of the Book of Abraham. The focus of de Verrier's critique was 3 illustrations or facsimiles that Joseph Smith copied from the Egyptian scrolls and published as part of his Book of Abraham. Below each of the facsimiles, Joseph provided his explanations of their meanings. According to Joseph, facsimile 1 depicts an idolatrous priest about to slay Abraham on an altar. The scene is specifically referred to in the text of the book itself.
And it came to pass that the priests laid violence upon me, that they might slay me also, as they did those virgins upon this altar. And that you may have a knowledge of this altar, I will refer you to the representation at the commencement of this record. Book of Abraham, chapter 1, verse 12.
But de Verrier noticed that there was something wrong with the pictures. They closely resembled scenes he had come across numerous times in common Egyptian burial documents. But Smith, according to de Verrier, had completely misidentified the characters and the scenes. In facsimile 1, Smith labeled the standing figure on the left as a priest, knife in hand, attempting to slay Abraham. In reality, said de Verrier, this is the Egyptian god Anubis, assisting the resurrection of a deceased Egyptian. Anubis was also drawn incorrectly. He should have been pictured with the head of a jackal, not the head of a man.
The god Anubis, who should have a jackal's head, effecting the resurrection of Osiris. Théodule de Verrier, 1859.
You would never imagine, as an Egyptologist, that the god, the black god on the left of this scene, had anything but a jackal's head. That's just normal.
Joseph Smith had explained another of the illustrations in the Book of Abraham, called facsimile 3, as Abraham, seated on Pharaoh's throne, lecturing the royal court on matters of astronomy. But again, de Verrier said Joseph's explanation was completely wrong. Facsimile 3 was also a rendition of a common scene from Egyptian burial documents, depicting a deceased man being led into the presence of Osiris, the Egyptian god of the underworld.
The deceased led by Matt into the presence of Osiris. His name is Horus, as may be seen in the prayer which is addressed to the divinities of the four cardinal points. Théodule de Veria, 1859.
Joseph said the characters above the man's hand identify him as Shulam. In actuality, the hieroglyphics give his name, Horus. There is no mention of Shulam at all.
The various initial analysis of facsimile 3 is accurate. It is the result of the judgment scene in which the deceased Horus is being brought into the presence of Osiris.
In the year 1912, Franklin S. Spaulding, the Episcopal Bishop of Utah, brought a new round of scrutiny to the Book of Abraham when he asked 8 noted scholars of Egyptology to evaluate the 3 facsimiles. To a man, they agreed that Joseph's explanations were erroneous.
It is difficult to deal seriously with Joseph Smith's impudent fraud. Smith has turned the goddess Isis into a king, and Osiris into Abraham. A.H. Sayce, Oxford University.
These 3 facsimiles of Egyptian documents in the Pearl of Great Price depict the most common objects in the mortuary religion of Egypt. Joseph Smith's interpretation of them as part of a unique revelation through Abraham, therefore, very clearly demonstrates that he was totally unacquainted with the significance of these documents and absolutely ignorant of the simplest facts of Egyptian writing and civilization. Dr. James H. Preston, University of Chicago.
The Egyptian papyrus, which Smith declared to be the Book of Abraham and translated or explained in his fantastical way, and of which 3 specimens are published in the Pearl of Great Price, are parts of the well-known Book of the Dead. And although the reproductions are very bad, one can easily recognize these familiar scenes. Dr. Eduard Meyer, University of Berlin.
The New York Times took note of Spaulding's findings and issued a blistering 2-page exposé on the Book of Abraham in its December 29, 1912 edition. The Mormon Church could not remain silent in the face of this withering attack on the credibility of Joseph Smith and the Book of Abraham. It offered assurances to the faithful in a 1913 article in its monthly magazine, The Improvement Era. The author, Professor John Henry Evans, argued that it wasn't fair to judge the credibility of Joseph's book by only reviewing the reproduced facsimiles. Evans insisted that to do any reasonable critique would require access to the original documents themselves.
Now, as a matter of fact, the hieroglyphics submitted to the scholars constitute less than 1/7 the Book of Abraham, and that only an accompaniment of the text. The question therefore becomes, is anyone justified in drawing a conclusion respecting an entire manuscript from a statement which was made with respect to only a very small part of that manuscript, before they would be warranted in saying that the entire Book of Abraham was not properly translated? They would have to examine the original papyrus, or a copy of it. John Henry Evans, Improvement Era, February 1913.
But the original Joseph Smith papyri were gone, almost surely destroyed in the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. Or were they? But in the spring of 1966, a dramatic discovery was made right here in New York at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Dr. Aziz Atiyah, a professor of Arabic studies from the University of Utah, was here doing research when he was approached by the curator of the museum's Department of Egyptian Antiquities, Dr. Henry G. Fisher. Fisher made a startling announcement. The museum had in its archives 11 papyrus fragments that had once belonged to Joseph Smith. Fisher didn't know how the Mormon church leaders would respond to this news, and he was looking for an intermediary. He wondered if Dr. Atiyah, a respected non-Mormon from Salt Lake City, could ask the Mormon church leaders if they would be interested in acquiring the papyri. Negotiations between the Metropolitan Museum and the Mormon Church proceeded, and on November 27, 1967, the museum presented the ancient scrolls to the church. An article in the Deseret News of Salt Lake City announced the gift of 11 papyrus fragments, long believed to have been destroyed in the Chicago Fire of 1871. With the papyri was the original 1856 letter signed by the Mormon prophet's widow, Emma Smith, certifying that the documents had belonged to Joseph Smith. But did these 11 papyrus fragments include the scroll Joseph identified as a lost book of Abraham? If so, there would finally be an opportunity to vindicate his miraculous claim of discovering and translating a document from the father of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Of course, there was also the possibility of undermining that claim. The saints waited expectantly and held their breath. Joseph Smith had dictated his translation of the original papyri to his scribes in the 1830s. It was important to identify whether or not the papyri found in the 1960s were the same ones Joseph used during this process. The first clue was the most obvious. The torn picture found in one of the fragments was an identical match to the familiar picture in the beginning of the Book of Abraham. In fact, the tears on the original corresponded exactly to where the Book of Abraham drawings seemed to go awry.
When you have the modern state of the papyrus today in front of you today, or the photographs of it or whatever, and you compare it with the facsimile number 1, you can see that where facsimile number 1 starts to become un-Egyptological, or unexpected from an Egyptological point of view, is pretty much along the line of the present break or destruction of the papyrus. So there's every reason from that point of view to believe that the present condition of the papyrus itself, is as it was in the time of Joseph Smith.
If you took a painting of Madonna and Child and you tore off the heads of both figures and you replaced them with a dog and a cat, it would be as obvious to us now that this was wrong as the replacing of the clearly a jackal head with a human head on this Egyptian piece, because we know what these images actually look like. In the same way, we know that those figures would never, under any circumstance, hold a knife. And that's critical to the text itself, because it's not merely decoration for this text. It goes to the core of the supposed story that accompanies it. And if you take the knife away, you've taken the story away as well. And clearly the knife had no reason to be there.
The Book of Abraham itself mentions that this scene appeared at the commencement of the record. In other words, at the beginning of the scroll. Egyptian reads from right to left. And Joseph Smith, who was at the time studying Hebrew, which also reads from right to left, must have surmised this. It seemed certain that this piece was the beginning of the scroll used by Joseph Smith. Then another discovery. A sequence of characters on a second piece of papyrus matched exactly a string of characters written in the left column of the translation manuscripts. It appeared that at Joseph's direction, his scribes copied these characters from the papyrus one by one. Joseph then dictated the meaning or translation of each one, often whole paragraphs from a single hieratic character. When Dr. Klaus Baer, professor of Egyptology at the University of Chicago, examined the papyri fragments, he determined that this same piece had at one time been attached to the piece containing facsimile 1. The fibers and edges matched exactly. A third piece was found to include the name Horus, the man for whom the scroll had been prepared. And though the original facsimile 3 has never been found, it also mentions the name Horus. Together, these 4 pieces form virtually the entire scroll in its original form. Finally, scholars could meet the conditions set forth by John Henry Evans way back in 1913. No longer would the critique of the accuracy of the Book of Abraham rely on the facsimiles alone. Now, Egyptologists could read the papyri for themselves and see whether they contained an evil priest's attempt to sacrifice Abraham on an altar, or an account of creation by a multiplicity of gods. In 2001, Dr. Robert Rittner, associate professor of Egyptology at the University of Chicago, was commissioned to do a complete translation of the Book of Abraham scroll.
What this document really is an extended prayer on behalf of a deceased Egyptian priest, which begins with an invocation to the god of mummification, probably, certainly with a picture of the god of mummification, to ensure his continued existence, to ensure the priest's continued existence in the next world. And then it's followed up by a series of statements where O deified Horus, may you walk as you had done in life. May your ears function, may your eyes function, may the gods receive you. Long series of invocations on this, essentially ensuring that this dead priest is able to function in death as he had in life, but now as part of a company of the ancient Egyptian gods. Abraham is not mentioned once.
From the evidence that we have today, it's quite safe to say that Joseph Smith did not have the Book of Abraham or the Book of Joseph in front of him in the form of these papyri, because they bear no relationship to those, to the contents of the stories or to his translation.
Of that in the Mormon Church and in the history department especially, and they try and define those things, they try and hide those things, and they don't encourage their people to actually be students of the Word. And because of that, they would find the errors in the Word. And so what we're doing in our church and what we do in biblical Christianity is God requires us to be students. Study to show yourself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. And we can do that, and God proves himself over and over again. And so I tell people often that God can answer all your questions. Are you big enough to accept his answers? Because that's where the real issue is. Do we really believe what God says? And God has proven himself and proven the Word, and the Word itself proves the Word. It's an amazing thing. I was talking with my son, Peter, who's very much into academia and scholarship and things, and he was saying just the last few chapters of the book of Job, where God is speaking, he said, man would never come up with that. The way he puts it in there. And just the word itself proves that it is from God. And we have how many manuscripts? We have the Dead Sea Scrolls. These things are studied. The New Testament manuscripts, I think there are around 5,600 of them now. An incredible amount of manuscripts. So, yeah.
Actually, I do occasionally study Egyptology in my spare time. I did recognize those images, and I could have told you right off.
They're wrong. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and that's one of the things about Egyptology. There is enough scholarly people around that have studied it in different forms that's obviously bogus. And but to a lot of the Mormon people, this is, well, it really doesn't matter to them. It's still a good social system and all this, and that's why they're in it. So somebody who's really inquiring, somebody who's really interested in being a student, these things are beneficial and can be used for us to witness and things of that sort. So